I've been using a series of movable, plastic-covered cold frames in the gardens for the past 4 years. These are my adaptation of a method that would have been fairly common in the past to create protected microclimates for growing vegetables. With the cool, wet and windy climate that we have here in Ireland, this type of crop protection can be really useful, especially in the spring. These days it's much more common to use permanent polytunnels or temporary row covers, which I use, but I also wanted to explore the use of these mini greenhouses that I could move around the gardens depending on which crops could benefit from them the most. These lightweight cold frames are not without their problems, including being too light for the windy conditions that we often get, but I've used them for more things than I had originally expected. A while ago, the plastic on one of my big polytunnels was seriously damaged by a fire and needed to be replaced. I wanted to reuse the good parts of the old sheet of plastic, and it seemed like a good opportunity to build a type of cold frame or a movable transparent box that I'd been thinking about. The standard beds in my garden are 10 meters long and about 90 centimeters wide, and it seemed that a useful size of box could cover about a quarter of a bed. This size could make use of half of a standard 4.8 meter lengths of lumber and be light enough to carry, and I figured that 2 of them could be joined together to cover half of a standard bed, and 4 could cover a full bed. I decided to use treated wood so that these frames would last a reasonable amount of time, but I wrapped the plastic around the bottom of the frame so the wood was not in direct contact with the soil. I designed and built them so that each of the 4 sides and the lid was independent and covered with plastic, with the idea that they could be easily put together with screws and hinges and taken apart for storage. In the 4 years since making them, I've never taken apart the sides, but I regularly remove the lids simply by unscrewing the hinge. The structure of this low box is simple and fairly sturdy, but keeping the lid open or keeping it closed has been more of a hassle. In order to ventilate the box on a sunny day, I initially used a block of wood to hold it up, but this tended to fall and allowed the lid to close and the plants to overheat. And I had some situations where the lid blew right over and damaged the crops on the adjacent bed, even when it was weighed down, and I eventually added twine to prevent the lid from opening too far. These lids need to be fixed open at a few different heights depending on the weather, and also fixed closed in really windy conditions. For a while, I used a sawtooth-shaped stick hinged on the lid, which could rest on the side on different heights, and I used a bolt to keep it in place. This was useful, but anything projecting out of the front of the box was going to be a hassle to get around when walking down the relatively narrow paths between the beds. For the past few years, I've used a scrap of wood hinged to the inside of the lid with holes in it that could fit over a wide head screw on the inside of the frame. This works well for keeping the lid open, but a bit awkward if it's misaligned, and it can't be used to keep the lid shut. I think I need to explore moving the support stick for the lids to the end of the boxes, where they can be hopefully useful and out of the way, but this may be more difficult with the longer double boxes. I built these cold frames mainly for spring and early summer crops, to provide slightly warmer growing conditions to plants so that we can start harvesting earlier in the season. In Ireland, the spring comes quite early in the year, at least compared to the colder parts of the world I grew up in, and we can get fast-growing, cool, salad-type crops in the ground quite early. But we don't necessarily have enough warmth, especially at night, and adding a little bit of extra warmth, even by a few degrees, seems to allow these cool season crops to grow a lot faster. Keeping out the hard winds and the driving rain also helps, especially to prevent damage to the tender leaves. Any kind of transparent or translucent cover can do this, and a length of fleece or row cover can be quite useful, especially if held off the plants with hoops or some kind of support frame. But this material needs to be weighed down quite a bit on the sides to prevent it from being blown away by the wind, which makes it more of a hassle to remove, to care for the plants, or just to see how they're doing. The hinge lid of the cold frames makes it a lot easier to see into the crops and for watering, and I can adjust the amount of protection quite easily. But it does mean that I can only access the plants from one side, and it is more difficult to reach the far side of the bed. This awkward access is one of the main disadvantages of using this type of cold frame, but I tend to just step into the bed to make things easier. I have used one of these cold frames in the polytunnel as a double layer of protection for tomato plants to protect them from unusually cold weather that we had later in the spring before they were transplanted. And I've used them as a place to propagate seedlings, and the adjustable lid makes it easier to harden off the plants before transplanting into the outside gardens. I also like to use the cold frames in the spring and early summer to offer protection to the squash, pumpkin, courgette, or zucchini plants. These are warm season plants that are easily damaged by late frost, and winds can cause issues with the big leaves, and any extra warmth I can give them can be really beneficial. With the courgette or zucchini plants, growing them under some form of cover means that they will be ready to harvest earlier in the season, and providing a longer growing season for the squash is essential in this climate to allow the fruit to ripen. A combination of crop cover and fleece over some pipe hoops might be a better option for the health of the plants, but a cold frame makes it easier to check on the plants and to harden them off, gradually exposing them to the wind and the rain, and also to allow the bees in to pollinate the flowers when they start to appear. For the last few years, I've been leaving the walls of the cold frames around the squash and courgette plants in one garden, but removing the lids entirely. I was thinking that this would make it easier to manage, to let the rain and the bees in, but the plastic sides would provide some shelter from the wind and help to contain these sprawling plants. I'm not sure how beneficial this is compared to removing the cold frames entirely, as I didn't do a proper side-by-side comparison. A few years ago, I set up one of these cold frames over some pallets in a partially shaded area and used this extra covered space to dry garlic. This worked quite well, keeping the rain off the garlic and allowing ventilation from above with the lid slightly open and below with the wind blowing through the pallets. And it was great to have a place to put the garlic out of the way where it could properly dry for more than a month. Last year I tried a similar thing with a densely planted bed of onions in one of the gardens, where I placed a cold frame over top of the whole bed when the onion bulbs were just starting to get really big. I kept the lid slightly open so it could ventilate, but still keep off most of the rain, and I lifted the frame off of the ground by setting it on a few rocks so that the wind was able to blow through the base of the plants. These onions were able to cure in drier conditions, reducing the potential impact of the wet weather we had, reducing the chance of decay, and possibly helping the onions to store for longer. This seemed like an appropriate use for these cold frames after they were no longer needed to protect other plants earlier in the season. And I think there are a number of different crops where drier and warmer conditions at particular times of the year could be really beneficial, especially when seed saving. I have not been so successful at making good use of these cold frames in the autumn and into the winter. I sometimes leave the walls around the courgette plants and replace the lid as the weather gets colder to try to extend the season, but this has not been so successful, I think mainly because these older plants tend to run out of steam. I also tend to run out of steam later in the summer and tend not to get around to sowing many of the late season crops that could really benefit from additional protection from the wind and the cooler conditions. And there are even some leafy crops that I could grow and harvest throughout the winter, but I tend not to get them in the ground, even in the polytunnel. But this could potentially be a really good use of these cold frames during the colder and darker parts of the year. Because they were not being used for something more important, a few months ago I put the 2 double cold frames over the full bed of overwintering garlic. Although garlic is a really hardy plant that doesn't need protection in this climate, I tend to cover them all winter so that they're not pulled up by the birds. And I've found that this covering during the winter helps them grow faster, leading to a potentially bigger crop. And this year's crop of garlic under the cold frames is doing really well. Moving these cold frames is easier than I thought it would be. They're not very heavy, they're just awkward. I have to move around the smaller ones by myself, and I've even grappled with the double-length cold frames. But of course, this is easier with 2 people and reduces the chance of collateral damage. If there is space, I often tilt the whole frame on its side to make access easier, or for putting the frame in place with a bit more control. When I do have help in the gardens, it's sometimes easier to simply lift the whole frame off of the bed when there's a lot of weeding or harvesting to do, and then put it back on when we're finished. The biggest issue with these cold frames is that they are too light and can be blown around in the wind. I built them with a sloping lid to face into the prevailing winds, and this helps most of the time, but a strong easterly wind can easily blow the lid open when they aren't properly secured, damaging the crop inside. I've also had a whole frame blown over into the next garden, rolled over by really strong wind, but thankfully there was not too much damage. I've gotten into the habit of placing a few pallets on top of the lid when we are expecting really windy weather, but sometimes even that weight is not enough. I also get lazy and don't take the pallets off as quickly as I should, so they probably overshadow the crop more than necessary. I need to come up with a way to securely anchor these cold frames to the ground in a way that will hold them down in the strong wind, but also allow them to be moved. And I need to come up with a way to secure the lid, both opened and closed. Apart from these issues with the wind, these cold frames are relatively low maintenance, but I do need to wash the plastic several times a year to remove the buildup of algae and dirt. The cleaner I can keep them, the more light can get into the crops and the more useful these cold frames are for the plants. Regular maintenance is an essential part of having any kind of infrastructure or tools in the gardens, and up until now I have not been great with this. It's been 4 years since I made these cold frames, and it's probably time to unscrew all the panels and properly clean them. And it would probably be a good time to make a few repairs, a few adjustments, and perhaps even replace some of the plastic that is damaged. These cold frames would be in better condition and probably last longer if I unscrewed them and stored the panels under cover when not in use, rather than just keeping them in the gardens. But a better option would probably be to plant more things to get more out of them. Keeping them in use will likely mean that I will look after them more. If I was only using these cold frames for early season crops, I'm not sure it would be worth the effort and resources to build and care for them, especially with the ease and convenience of other types of crop covers. They are potentially useful in the summer when a little bit more heat and protection from the wind and rain is helpful, and I'd like to explore growing heat-loving crops in the outside gardens that I usually only grow in the polytunnels. But I think it is the autumn and overwintering crops that I really need to focus on, to do the work in the summer and early autumn to sow the cool season crops so that I can get the most out of these cold frames, as well as increasing the range and quality of crops that I'm able to harvest at a time of year when the sun is rarely seen and the wind and rain are my usual companions in the gardens.